Okay, welcome to Money Matters, tuition fees and funding for higher education students funded by Student Finance England. This is a presentation by the University of the West of England, Bristol. It will last approximately 10 minutes. The aim of this presentation is to give you a broad overview of how the student funding system works and to give you an idea of what funding you can expect to receive if you study a higher education undergraduate degree course here at the University of the West of England, Bristol. This presentation is for UK and EU students. The presentation will cover the amount of tuition fees charged, details of the English funding system. If you are from Wales, please see the Student Finance Wales tuition fees and funding presentation. So let's start with tuition fees. These are the tuition fees that are currently charged to UK and EU students. The maximum tuition fee charge is set by central government, so could vary in future years. International overseas students are charged a higher level of tuition fees. If you are studying on a part-time course, the tuition fees are a pro rata amount. It's important to note that it's not just your nationality which determines whether you are charged a UK, EU or international rate of tuition fees, or whether you can access student finance funding. It is also your length of residency in the UK or EU prior to starting the course.
Okay, we have a question in from Sarah. Sarah would like to know, how are the fees paid?
Okay, yeah, thank you, Sarah. That's a good question. So with regards to the tuition fees, essentially, if you take out the tuition fee loan, which we'll talk about in a second, then that will mean that the tuition fees are essentially paid directly to the university in the form of a loan to you. So I'll give you a bit more details of in terms of how the tuition fee loan works a bit later on. But essentially, you apply for the student funding. If you take out the fee loan, the tuition fees are paid directly to the university in the form of a loan for you. Okay.
Sorry, just one more question while we're on this slide, Graham. Is the fee for the whole of the course?
No, it's not for the whole of the course. So the tuition fee, the amount that you can see on the screen is per academic year. So you'll be charged an amount of tuition fees for each academic year of the course, and you apply for the fee loan for each year of the course, and then the fees will be paid directly to the university in the form of a loan to you. Okay, so so as I was saying, it's important to note that it's not just your nationality which determines whether you're charged a UK, EU or international rate of fees, or whether you can access student finance funding. It's also your length of residency in the UK or EU prior to starting the course. So for example, a British citizen who has lived in Australia for 7 years and has been living back in the UK for 1 year is likely to be charged international fees. If you think you could be affected by having lived abroad or are unsure if you will be charged a UK, EU or international rate of tuition fees, please contact us for further advice. Okay, so before we look at the funding available, it's important to be aware that having previous study at a higher education level can affect the funding available for any new course. This could have been higher education study in the UK or abroad, even if you self-funded the study or even if you studied years ago. If you abandoned a previous course, then the number of years of funding for the new course may be affected. Similarly, if you achieved a lower level qualification, such as a Higher National Certificate, a HNC, or a Higher National Diploma, a HND, or a foundation degree, the number of years of funding for the new course may be affected. If you've already achieved an honours degree, you are unlikely to receive any funding for a second degree. There are exemptions for certain subjects, however, which means that you can get limited or full funding for a second degree. For architecture and social work, for example, you can receive a maintenance loan for a second degree, but not a tuition fee loan. Students funded by Student Finance England can receive full funding for a second degree in a pre-registration healthcare course, such as nursing or midwifery. If you wish to study a science, technology, engineering or maths subject, known as a STEM subject, as a second degree, you can receive full funding, but only if you study on a part-time course. It's very important to seek advice before you embark on a course if you have any previous higher education study to ensure you will receive funding for the duration of your course. The next few slides will provide an overview of the funding available for full-time courses and part-time courses for students funded by Student Finance England. The presentation will then go on to explain how you are assessed for this funding before going into more detail about how much funding you could expect to receive. Now let's look at the funding available. If you usually reside in England, then you will apply to Student Finance England for your funding. If you are eligible for funding, you can expect to receive the following for a full-time course. For UK and EU students, a tuition fee loan to cover the amount of tuition fees charged. This is non-means tested, which means your household income does not affect entitlement. For UK students only, living cost funding in the form of a repayable maintenance loan up to the amount shown, depending on whether you live away from home or with your parents while studying. Additional support is available for students with disabilities or students who have children or adults that are financially dependent on them. The next part of this presentation will explain how you are assessed for this funding, but firstly, here's some important information for EU students. The government have announced that funding for EU students starting a degree course in the 2020-2021 academic year will continue to be available for the duration of their course, irrespective of when the UK exit the EU. No decision has yet been made for students planning to start a degree course from the 2021-2022 academic year onwards. This will depend on the outcome of Brexit. Generally, EU students are eligible for a tuition fee loan. In order to qualify for living costs funding, you need to satisfy certain residency requirements and have long residency in the UK or be a migrant worker. Please refer to our web pages or contact us if you have any queries about this. So, how does the government decide how much money each individual student will get in order to go to university? If you are under 25, you are usually considered to be dependent on your parents, unless you fall within certain categories which we will cover later. Your living cost funding will be assessed based on both of your parents' income if they live together, or if your parents are separated, the parent you live with or have more contact with, and if they have one, their cohabiting partner. Student Finance England will take into account the parental income from the previous tax year. This is a tax year that starts 2 years prior to the start of your course.
I've got a question in from Sarah Graham.
Okay.
Sarah would like to know, what if I turn 25 during the course?
Yes, that's a good question. Thank you, Sarah. So essentially, if you turn 25 during the course, then from the following academic year, you'll be treated as an independent student. And that will change how your funding is assessed, and I'll explain that a bit later on. So usually if you're under 25, you're classed as being dependent on your parents. If you're 25 or over, you're classed as being independent. And if you turn 25 during the course, you're also classed as being independent, but not until the following academic year. Okay, so Student Finance England will take into account the parental income for those under 25 from the previous tax year. Now that is a tax year that starts 2 years prior to the start of the course. If, however, by the start of your course, parents expect their income to have decreased by at least 15% since the previous tax year, they can request a current year income assessment. Having a current year income assessment where income has decreased may result in a student's funding increasing. Student Finance England will also take into account an estimate of the student's taxable unearned income for the academic year the application relates to. This is usually income such as interest on taxable savings, trust funds, or income from properties such as rent. If the student is released by an employer who will continue to pay them during their studies, this income is taken into account. Any income a student earns from part-time work during their course or full-time work prior to the start of their course is completely ignored in the income assessment. This is to allow students to work part-time during their studies without being penalised. Now, if you are 25 or over, you are automatically considered to be independent and your parents' income will not be taken into account. If you live with a partner, it will be their income that your funding is assessed on. Their income is assessed in the same way as parental income. When Student Finance England calculate income, they will deduct amounts for dependent children, but won't take into account actual outgoings such as rent or mortgage. Again, Student Finance England take into account an estimate of the student's taxable unearned income for the academic year the application relates to. If you are under 25, you are considered independent if any of the following apply. If you have care of a child, if you are or have been married or in a civil partnership, if you are permanently and irreconcilably estranged from your parents, if you are a care leaver, if both of your parents are deceased, or if you have supported yourselves for 36 months before the course starts. This doesn't need to be consecutive, but must cover a full 36-month period. If any of these apply to you, you will need to provide evidence to Student Finance England. Start collating the evidence now, especially if you've been self-supporting or consider yourself as estranged. Please refer to our web pages or contact us if you would like any further advice on proving independence through self-supporting or estrangement. So now you know whose income is taken into account and what portion of that income. Let's have a look in more detail how much funding you could expect to receive. This table shows how much maintenance loan you can expect to get each year and how the assessed household income affects the amount of maintenance loan you can expect to receive if you are living away from home. The amount is slightly less if you live with your parents while studying. The amount of repayable loan you will receive is shown in blue. The part in red is a reduction of the loan from the maximum and is money that you do not receive. Those students from a household with a lower income on the left of the graph can expect to receive the full amount of maintenance loan. As the household income increases, the amount of maintenance loan decreases until you reach the upper threshold figure shown in the right of the graph. Household income figures at or above the upper threshold will receive the non-means tested amount of maintenance loan as shown on the right in blue.
We've got another question in, Graham.
Okay.
Does this loan cover my accommodation costs?
Okay, yeah, that's a very good question. So the amount of loan that you get is for maintenance or living costs, and it's in order to cover all of your living costs, which would include things like rent as well as food, bills, etc., everything you need to live on. But the government doesn't take into account how much your actual accommodation costs are. So it may mean that the amount of living cost loan that you're given may not always cover all of your accommodation costs. The only thing that the government would look at is what is either your parents' income or what is your partner's income, and that's the only thing that determines the amount of living cost loan you get. So it's really important to look at how much living cost loan you get before you make decisions on where you choose to live, for example, because you're expected to pay for your accommodation costs from this loan, but it may not cover all of your accommodation costs, especially if you're living in a more high cost accommodation.
I've got another question.
Oh, yeah.
I've got another
Okay.
2 questions actually.
Yeah.
What do I get if my parental income is 70,000? And then following that, how is the fund made?
Okay. Yes, so both good questions. So you can see on this graph that the income amount goes down and down the higher the household income is, but that minimum amount you can expect to receive whatever your income. So even if your income was £70,000, for example, you'd still receive that minimum living cost loan amount in blue. So the bare minimum you would get would be a fee loan to cover your tuition fees, and that's irrespective of household income, and also the bare minimum living cost loan. So that minimum amount in blue on the right, that doesn't go down any further, even if you were a millionaire, for example, or your parent or partner was a millionaire, you'd still be able to access that minimum amount of maintenance loan available. What was this?
How is the funding paid?
Okay, yeah. So with regards to the maintenance loan or living cost loan, that money is paid to you in termly instalments. So it's paid directly to the student in termly instalments throughout the academic year. So it's entirely up to you as a student how much living cost loan you choose to take out. You don't have to take out any if you don't want to, but you can take out anything up to those maximum figures. And however much you choose to take out, it will be paid to you in termly instalments. So if you were starting in September, for example, you'd expect an instalment in September, and then another one in January, and then another one around about April time.
So there was another question, but I think you probably answered it. It was, do you have to take the full amount of loan? I think you probably just answered that one, Graham, and said that you can choose to take out the amount that you want.
Exactly. Perfect. Okay. So as I was saying, our advice is to look at how much funding you're likely to receive each year, and then speak to your parents or your partner, whoever's funding affects the amount of money you get if your funding is reduced, and then discuss whether they're able to contribute towards your living costs to help make up any difference. So in addition to the living cost funding on the previous slide, you may also receive some additional weeks of funding. Now, most of the UE courses, that's University of West of England courses, attract around 4 or 5 extra weeks of funding. Healthcare courses such as nursing and midwifery are often longer and therefore attract more funding. The additional weeks will increase the repayable maintenance loan and are means tested. Hopefully, having watched this, you will have a better understanding of what funding will be available to you to study at the University of the West of England, Bristol. Now you've watched this presentation, see the rest of our series. Our advice is to start looking into what funding you will get before you arrive and plan your budget in advance. Apply for your funding as soon as you are able to, even if you're unsure which university you will go to. It's better to have your application in early and approved. You can always make changes or cancel the application at a later date. You can apply online for this funding, and you'll need to reapply for your funding each academic year. Applications for funding usually open in the spring. For further information, please have a look at these websites. If you need further advice, please email our Student Money Service. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Graham. That was brilliant.